The rain had stopped just before dusk, leaving the earth smelling of wet clay and crushed jasmine. The little house on the edge of the village glowed faintly through the fog, its windows breathing out soft orange light. Inside, a girl sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her henna-stained hands trembling against the folds of her wedding shawl. She was 19, barely a woman, and yet tonight, the world already called her a wife. Her name was Mare. She'd never seen the man she was to marry until that morning, when he came to her father's courtyard riding a tired brown horse. His clothes were patched, his boots covered in dust, his eyes steady and quiet. The village women had whispered that he was a poor farmer, no land of his own, only the strength of his back and the stubborn will to keep moving. But he had a calmness that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Her father, desperate to marry her before another debt collector arrived, had smiled too widely that day. "He's a good man," he'd said. "He'll feed you." That was all it took to sign her future away. The ceremony had been brief, the feast small. The songs had faded before the stars fully rose. Now, the sound of crickets filled the room where she sat, waiting. Her heart pounded in her throat when the door opened and he stepped inside. His name was Adil. He removed his turban slowly, shaking off the rain, his broad shoulders shadowing the flickering lamp. Mare looked down quickly, her pulse rushing, her hands clenching tighter. She had been taught that the first night defined everything, that a husband claimed what was his, and a wife must endure. She prayed under her breath that he would be gentle, or at least swift. But Adil didn't come closer. He stopped by the table, where a single cup of milk stood untouched. He poured it into 2 clay cups instead, set one before her, and sat on the floor rather than the bed. His voice, when it came, was deep and low. "You're afraid," he said simply. Mare didn't answer. Her throat was too tight. "I don't blame you," he continued. "They married you without asking, didn't they?" Tears burned behind her eyes. No one had dared speak the truth aloud, not even her mother. She looked up, startled, and found his eyes on her, not demanding, not cold, just steady. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "I won't touch you unless you ask me to." The world seemed to tilt. She stared at him, unsure she'd heard right. Every story she'd heard from other girls, every warning whispered behind doors, said the same thing: the wedding night was the end of innocence, not the beginning of choice. Yet this man, her husband, was offering silence, distance, even safety. "Drink," he said gently. "It's been a long day." Her hands shook as she took the cup. The milk was warm, slightly sweet. For the first time since morning, her heart began to slow. Adil leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs out. "My first wife died 2 winters ago," he said after a moment. "Fever took her. I didn't think I'd marry again. But your father came to me, he said you needed a home. I thought maybe I needed one too." Mare listened in silence. His voice carried no self-pity, only a quiet honesty that filled the small room. "I don't expect love," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But respect, kindness, that's something we can start with." Her eyes stung. No one had spoken to her like that before. Respect was a word used for men, elders, teachers, not for young wives sold into survival. When he finally stood to spread a blanket on the floor, she found her voice. "You'll sleep there?" she asked softly. He looked at her, a small, tired smile flickering on his face. "A bed is no place for fear. You take it tonight." The lamp burned low. The wind outside carried the scent of wet wheat in silence. She watched him lie down on the floor, his arm folded under his head, his breath slow and even. For a long time, she couldn't move. Then she turned off the lamp and lay down, staring into the dark, her heart tangled with confusion, gratitude, and something else she didn't yet understand. Days turned into weeks. Life in the small farmhouse was hard but peaceful. Adil rose before dawn, tending the fields with calloused hands. He never complained, never raised his voice. When he returned, he brought her small things from the market: soap, ribbons, once even a wooden comb. He left them quietly by her side, never asking for thanks. At first, Mare kept her distance. She cooked, cleaned, and stayed silent, afraid to do or say the wrong thing. But the silence between them slowly became less sharp, less like a wall and more like a field, wide and waiting. One evening, she saw him struggling to lift a broken plow. Without thinking, she ran to help. He tried to stop her, but she took one side anyway. When the metal finally shifted free, They both laughed, surprised by the sound. It was the first time laughter had touched that yard in years. From that day, something began to grow quietly between them, something fragile, patient. She learned that he hummed while he worked, that he couldn't read but counted every seed in his head, that he talked to his mule as though it were a brother. And he learned that she loved music, that her mother had once sung to her every night before sleep, that she missed the river by her old home. He began to build a small channel from the well to the yard, so water could flow past her window. So it sounds like the river, he said simply. When spring came, the fields turned green. Mare started planting flowers near the doorstep. Each day, she waited for his return, her heart no longer heavy but curious. He still never crossed the boundary he had drawn that first night. But sometimes, when their hands brushed as he passed her a bowl or a tool, she felt something wordless bloom beneath her skin. One evening, a storm rolled over the hills, fierce and sudden. Lightning split the sky as a deal rushed to tie down the animals. Mare waited by the door, fear twisting in her chest until she saw him running back, soaked through, his shirt clinging to his chest. Without thinking, she reached for a towel and pulled him inside. "You'll catch cold," she said, voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "You sound like her," he murmured. "Like who?" "My mother." For a moment, silence filled the space between them again, but it was different now. It pulsed, alive. She took the towel and began drying his hair, her fingers brushing against his skin. He didn't move. His breath came slower, heavier. When she finally met his eyes, something shifted between them, a quiet understanding, a shared ache. Her hands dropped. "You said you wouldn't touch me," she whispered. "I still won't," he said softly. "Unless you ask." The words lingered in the air, fragile and steady. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I'm asking." That night, the storm outside raged, but inside the small house, everything was still. He held her as though she were something sacred, something fragile and fierce at once. There was no rush, no taking, only giving, only listening. When dawn came, the world smelled of wet earth again. The fields shimmered with dew, and the first light brushed against her face. She woke to find his hand still resting over hers. He was watching her quietly, as if afraid she might vanish. "Was it what you expected?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "It was what I hoped for, though I didn't know it." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Then that's enough." Years later, when people in the village spoke of the farmer and his young wife, they called theirs a quiet kind of love, one that grew not from fire but from soil and patience. They never knew the story of the wedding night that began not with fear, but with a choice, the night a poor man's gentleness taught an innocent girl what it meant to belong without being owned. The morning after the storm, Mare walked out into the courtyard barefoot. The soil was soft and cool, the air washed clean by rain. The small flowers she'd planted along the doorway glistened with dew, bending under the weight of droplets. She could hear the gentle rhythm of Adil's axe from the woodshed, steady, precise, familiar now. Something in her felt lighter. For the first time since she came to this house, she didn't feel like a guest. The quiet around her no longer carried loneliness, it carried belonging. When Adil noticed her standing there, he paused mid-swing. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but close. "You should wear shoes," he said. "The ground's still cold." She laughed softly. "It feels good. It reminds me I'm alive." He set the axe down, wiped his brow with the edge of his sleeve, and looked at her as though memorizing her face. The way the wind lifted her veil, the faint trace of laughter in her eyes, he realized how much he had missed that sound. "I was afraid you'd regret it," he said quietly. Mare's gaze softened. "I don't." He nodded once, and for a moment they stood there, neither speaking, the world hushed except for the rustle of leaves. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. That spring, life began to move in rhythms she had never known. She rose early to light the stove, to prepare his tea and bread. She learned how to plant seeds the way he did, by whispering to the soil, as if asking it for mercy. He, in turn, taught her how to tell when rain was coming, how to read the sky's moods. They were two people learning the language of each other's silence. Sometimes, she'd sit by the doorway as he worked in the fields, her hands busy with sewing, her eyes following the movement of his shoulders in the distance. She noticed the small things, how he stopped to let a stray calf drink from the trough, how he always saved the last piece of bread for her when the food ran short. When he came home tired and sunburned, she'd have cool water waiting. He never asked for it, but she offered it every time. That small act became their quiet way of saying what neither yet dared to speak aloud. One evening, the village headman came to their house. He was a stout man with a heavy voice and eyes that always seemed to measure more than they saw. He greeted Adil with a forced smile. "Your fields are thriving this year," he said. "You've done well." Adil nodded politely. "It's been a good season." The headman's gaze shifted toward Mare, who stood by the doorway with a tray of tea. "Your wife's adjusting well, I see," he said with a tone that made her skin prickle. Adil's eyes hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "She is. And I'd appreciate it if that was the only thing you came to ask about." The man laughed, pretending to be offended, and left after finishing his tea. But that night, Mare couldn't shake the unease that settled over her. She had seen the way the headman looked at her, as if she were a thing, not a person. Later, as they sat under the dim lamplight, she spoke hesitantly. "He doesn't like you, does he?" Adil shrugged. "He doesn't like that I don't owe him anything. Men like him need people to kneel. I don't." She looked at him, a flicker of worry in her eyes. "What if he tries to make trouble? Then we face it," he said simply. "Together." That word, together, stayed with her long after the lamp went out. It became her anchor. Months passed, and with the rains came new life. Mare planted vegetables behind the house. Adil built a new fence from fallen wood. Their days filled with work, laughter, small arguments about nothing that ended with shared smiles. Slowly, love took root, not the fiery, sudden kind sung about in village songs, but something steady, like sunlight on wheat. One afternoon, as Mare was washing clothes by the well, she saw Adil walking toward her with something hidden behind his back. His face carried that same shy half-smile she had come to know. "What are you hiding?" she asked, squinting at him. He stopped in front of her and revealed a small, hand-carved wooden flute. "You said you missed music." She blinked, taken aback. The flute was simple but beautiful, polished smooth, the holes carefully shaped. "You made this?" He nodded. "Tried to, at least. Might not sound like much." She lifted it to her lips and blew softly. A sweet, trembling note filled the air. Then another. Soon, the sound floated across the fields, wrapping the world in something warm and alive. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her as if she'd just turned the evening gold. "I didn't think you'd actually play," he said. She smiled. "You should know by now, I don't do what people expect." That night, as she played by the window, he sat nearby sharpening his tools, listening in silence. The notes were uneven, but they carried peace. And in that peace, both of them found something like home. But happiness, like weather, never stays still. That autumn, a drought swept through the region. The rain that had once blessed their crops turned to dust. The riverbeds cracked, and even the air grew thin with heat. Adil worked from dawn to dusk trying to save what little grain they had left, his body growing leaner by the week. Mare did what she could, rationing food, carrying water from the well miles away. At night, when he came home exhausted, she'd rub the soreness from his hands, whispering comfort in the dim light. One evening, after weeks of silence from the sky, she found him sitting alone outside, staring at the empty fields. His hands were clasped together, his eyes distant. "We'll lose most of it," he said quietly. "All that work." She sat beside him. "Then we'll start again when it rains." He shook his head. "You don't understand, Mare. Seeds cost money. Tools break. There's debt coming I can't pay." She placed her hand over his. "Then we'll find a way. We always do." He turned to her, searching her face. "You're not afraid of losing crops?" she asked softly. "No, I'm only afraid of losing you." Her words struck something deep within him. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips, eyes closed, as if drawing strength from her pulse. The next day, he sold the last of his livestock to buy new seeds. Neighbors whispered that he was a fool, that he should have saved the money for himself. But Mare believed in him. Every morning, she worked beside him, sowing the dry ground with hope. And then, one night, the rain returned. It came with thunder and wind, crashing against the roof. Mare ran out laughing, lifting her hands to the sky as water poured down her face. Adil followed, watching as she spun barefoot in the mud, her hair clinging to her cheeks. "Come inside," he shouted, but she only laughed louder. When he finally went to her, she caught his hand. You see, she said breathlessly. It always comes back. He looked at her, this woman who had once been a frightened girl in a red shawl, and saw strength he'd never known existed. Yes, he whispered. It does. The months that followed were good ones. The fields grew thick again, golden and full. There. Laughter returned. The flute played often by the window. They began dreaming of building another room, of buying more land, of maybe one day raising a child. But fate, as always, had its own plans. Late one night, Adele didn't come home. The sky was moonless, and Mare's heart pounded as she waited by the door. When she finally saw him in the distance, she realized he was limping. Blood stained his sleeve. She ran to him, panic rising. What happened? Thieves, he said through gritted teeth. They tried to take the mule. I fought back. She guided him inside, tears spilling as she cleaned the wound on his arm. It wasn't deep, but it shook her, the thought of losing him. Why didn't you just let them take it? She whispered. He smiled faintly. Because everything we have, we built together. I couldn't let them undo that. When she finished bandaging him, she sat beside him, her hands trembling. He reached for her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You've made this place more than a home, he said softly. You've made me more than a man. Her eyes filled with tears. And you made me more than a wife. That night, she stayed awake long after he fell asleep, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Gratitude ached inside her, gratitude for love that had grown from kindness, for a life she had once feared but now couldn't imagine losing. Years later, when the villagers spoke of Adele and Mare, they said theirs was the kind of love that didn't shout, it whispered. It worked, it waited, it forgave. Their house became a place where travelers found shelter, where orphans found warmth, where silence was soft and laughter real. And every night, before the lamp went out, Mare would pick up the old wooden flute and play, soft notes drifting into the dark, carrying across the fields like a prayer that had found its answer in the heart of a poor farmer who had once promised her nothing but kindness, and given her everything. Years slipped by like gentle seasons, marked not by calendars but by harvests, rains, and the slow rhythm of two hearts that had learned to live as one. Mare and Adele grew older, their hands lined with work, their faces weathered by sun and laughter. The world around them changed, new families settled nearby, children's laughter filled the valley again, but their small house remained the same, simple, warm, full of quiet light. In the mornings, Mare still woke to the sound of Adele's footsteps outside, though slower now, his back bent from years of toil. She would set tea on the wooden table and wait for him to return from the fields. Sometimes they spoke of little things, the stubborn cow that refused to eat, the neighbors' quarrels, the crops that needed tending, but often, they didn't need words at all. Their silence had grown richer with time, filled with memories that spoke louder than speech. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon gold, Adele sat beside her on the porch. His hands, scarred and strong, rested quietly on his knees. Mare leaned her head against his shoulder. The years had softened them both, yet there was still a spark between them, as if all those years ago, in that small wedding room of silence and fear, something divine had taken root and never stopped growing. Do you ever think, Mare said softly, of that night? When you said you wouldn't touch me unless I asked. Adele smiled faintly. I do. You were trembling so hard, I thought you'd run away before morning. I almost did, she admitted, laughing quietly. But then you said something no one ever had before, you gave me a choice. That changed everything. He turned to her, his eyes warm and steady. It changed me too, Mare. I thought I was just marrying a girl who needed shelter. But you taught me what a home really means. The sky deepened into violet, and the first stars began to shimmer. The wind carried the faint scent of wheat and jasmine, her favorite. She looked at him, her heart heavy with gratitude and a quiet ache that words could never hold. When Adele's health began to fail that winter, Mare stayed by his side through every night of fever and breathless silence. He would wake sometimes, reach for her hand, and whisper, "Still here." Always, she'd answer. One cold morning, as dawn broke soft and pale, his hand slipped gently from hers. The fields outside were covered in frost, glimmering like glass. She didn't cry at first, she only sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering prayers into the stillness. Days later, when she buried him under the lone tree near the fields, she placed his old wooden flute beside the grave.